Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Um, a few words before we get started. I'm going to introduce our guest and our topic in just a moment. Um, this webinar is being recorded. A link to the webinar is going to be sent out afterwards to everyone who is registered for the webinar, whether you were able to attend for the entire event or not. Um, we are going to be taking questions on the end of the presentation. Please use the question box, use the question button on the bottom of your screen to enter your questions as they occur to you, so that when we're done the presentation, we can look at the questions pane and we can see what questions are available and launch right into it without waiting for anybody. So, as questions occur to you, please enter them in the pane. We'll try to answer as many as we can on the end. We might go over just a few minutes. If you have to fade out, at the top of the hour, don't worry about that. Again, you will get a recording link, and you can finish up with the question and answer on the end of the recording link. Um, and I think that's it. If there's technical issues that you're having, send a chat to the panelists, and we'll try to answer those or deal with those issues as they arise. So, with that said, our guest today is Christina Kiefer. Christina
Hello.
is an attorney at law, a senior associate focused on digital business at Reusch Law. And we're going to be talking about NIS2 and the new CRA. These are the new rules, directives, regulations, the details Christina is going to go into in the European Union for technology that involves software, computers, hardware, and so on. And I'm Andrew Ginter, by the way, VP Industrial Security. But anyone who's been on these calls before knows me already. I'm at Waterfall Security Solutions. So um, with that introduction, Christina, I'm going to hand things over. Oh, actually, I've got the first couple of slides, don't I? There we go. Thank you. So, before I hand it over to Christina, I'm going to give a couple of slides of background for anyone who hasn't seen it. Um, in terms of, where are these new rules coming from? It's because the threat environment is changing. These are numbers from Waterfall's 2025 threat report. We track deliberate attacks, okay, not errors and omissions, not equipment failures, deliberate cyber attacks on heavy industry and critical industrial infrastructure. Deliberate attacks on heavy industry with physical consequences, not stole some money, not stole a little information. We're talking about attacks that shut down production, that delayed production, that damaged equipment or worse, um, in the public record. No confidential disclosures. What does that data set look like? This is the data set all the way back to 2010. The URL is on the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to dig into the data set, it's in the appendix of the report. Download the report, and the entire data set is there. What we observe is that for the decade 2010 through 2019, things are mostly flat. We're talking one or two, up to five of these attacks per year. Um, and some years there were zero. And at the turn of the decade, we're talking 2019, 2020, the world changed. And suddenly we have tens or pushing 100 of these attacks per year, most of which affect multiple sites. Last year, the number was 76 attacks that met this criteria, affecting over 1,000 sites. Most of these attacks are ransomware. We've observed three ways that ransomware affects physical operations. You might ransomware might get into the IT network, mess around with the IT network, and we shut down physical operations because it's a safety critical system, and we cannot afford to be running it if we are not confident of the strength of our security program, and we fear that the attack might move from IT into OT. This is the abundance of caution scenario. This is roughly 1/3 of the shutdowns due to ransomware. Um, Dependencies are roughly, back of the envelope, another third, meaning nothing in OT was crippled, but technology in IT was crippled that is essential to the operation of the OT system. And so we had to shut down because technology that we need. Textbook example is Maersk shipping. When NotPetya hit Maersk, they were down for 6 days. It was not because the bad stuff got into the ship's control systems. The ship sailed perfectly safely into port. It was not because the bad stuff got into the cranes and killed the cranes. No, the cranes could safely lift the containers off the ships and put them into the waiting trucks, and then everything stopped because the container tracking system was on the IT network, and the IT network had been crippled. Nobody could log into the container tracking system. So these dependencies are roughly one third. And of course, the last third is what you expect. The bad stuff messes with OT systems, and we have to shut down because we don't have a control system anymore. So this is the world we live in. The threat environment changed dramatically for OT at the beginning of the year, or sorry, the beginning of the decade, and we're seeing regulators respond. Next slide, please, Christina. Um, Nation state attacks are changing as well. Um, Last year we saw, this is the blue bar. Last year there were 3 times as many nation state attacks as in any of the preceding 15 years. They're still small numbers. We're talking 6 of these attacks. But we lump together nation state and hacktivist here because a lot of the time ransomware affects OT systems in a sense only accidentally. Nation states and hacktivists have a political agenda. They target OT systems deliberately, and we're seeing these deliberately targeted attacks increasing as well, and so are the authorities. Next slide, please. Um, what's being impacted here? The biggest impact is on manufacturing. So we're talking automobile manufacturing, we're talking computer manufacturing, we're talking cell phone manufacturing, anything that takes small parts and assembles them into bigger parts. Um, Second biggest is transportation. Everything from uh, oil and gas ports, you know, with ships coming in, to rail systems and metros, to buses and trucking companies that are delivering products to customers. The impacted regions, um, in the last 10 years, it's bounced around. The top 3 have bounced around between the USA, Canada, and Germany. In 2024, the data shows for the first time Canada slipped out of the top 3. Japan and the UK are into the top targets. Why are these the top targets? Hard to say. There's a lot of manufacturing in these geographies. There's a lot of money to be stolen by ransomware in these geographies. But if you look at the rest of the regions, a lot of European countries in those regions. The other, is a whole list of countries. Again, a lot of European countries in there that only had 1 or 2 incident in the geography. So in a sense, everyone's being hit. And again, the authorities are seeing this. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, my last slide. This is another evidence of what's going on in the threat environment. For the last 15 years, in the last 15 years, there have been, counted, I think it's 10 or 11 varieties, strains, types of malware come out that understand industrial control systems, that deliberately target industrial control systems. Last year, 2024, 3 of them were discovered. That's as many as were discovered in the previous 7 years. Again, is this random happenstance and we'll go back to sort of 1 every couple of years in the next couple of years? Is this a trend? We don't know. Is this AI making it easier for the bad guys to write the malware, and so we're seeing more of it? We don't know. But again, these are all trends that the regulators are following, and they're looking at the threat environment and saying, we have to do something about this. Next slide, please. So that's
Yes,
my introduction. Christina, yep, it's over to you.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for the good introduction. And you have seen now the reports looking at the worldwide ransomware and cybersecurity threats, and now looking more on the EU level as well as the German level as an example. Because you see here the status quo in the EU, I have written dynamic threat situation versus a static legal situation. And this is the situation we have right now. You see the numbers here, and the numbers here are from a report of the German Federal Office for Information Security, the Bundesamt für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik, so the operation is BSI. And here in 2022, during the reporting period, an average of about 68 new vulnerabilities in Germany were disclosed every single day. And those were already around 24% more than in the previous reporting periods. Then, looking at the period of 2023, an average of 78 new vulnerabilities were disclosed each and every day. So with a focus on 22 to 23, you see that 40% more of new vulnerabilities were disclosed. But then looking on the other side at the regulation sector, you see that the status quo right now, we don't have any general cybersecurity laws, whether for companies nor for products. We have some specific cybersecurity regulation for specific sectors or for specific products, but we don't have any general cybersecurity law. That's why the EU legislator has stepped in and has looked at the new EU digital law. There we have a legislative train I have linked for you in the slides, and the legislative train is called A Europe Fit for the Digital Age. When you're looking at this train, you see that there are 114 projects with only the focus to the digitalization and the digital products, and 89 of them have a legislative nature. So you see there will a lot of new provisions will come into force and affect products and also companies. When you're looking further on in the legislative train, that you see there is also specific focus on cybersecurity because of the current threat situation. Because you see the EU legislator emphasizes the digitization of products, but also of companies, and also emphasizes the speed of innovation versus the regulatory burden that we have right now. But let's have a closer look at the two regulations we would like to focus on today. It's the NIS2 Directive and the Cyber Resilience Act. And the NIS2 Directive and the Cyber Resilience Act are one of the two main building blocks of the new European cybersecurity architecture. Just as an introduction for you to understand the differences between regulation and directive, the NIS2 Directive is a company-related directive. Company-related means it focuses on the cybersecurity of specific companies of specific sectors. Directive means it needs to be transposed into national law by the EU member states. The Cyber Resilience Act, on the other hand, is a product-related regulation. So it's focusing on the cybersecurity of specific products, of so-called products with digital elements. And it is a regulation, so it doesn't have to be transposed into national law. It will be directly applicable in all EU member states. Looking at the status of both of the regulatory frameworks, the NIS2 Directive entered already into force in January 2023, but as I said before, it needs to be transposed into national law. And this hasn't happened by all EU member states, so that's why we don't have all over the EU right now the necessary national law right now. The Cyber Resilience Act came already also into force in December 2024. We don't have any transition into national law, but we have a transition period. So the obligations of the CRA will come into force, no, will not come into force, will be applicable within up to 3 years. So having a closer look at NIS2 Directive, some of the key facts right now. The NIS2 Directive is a company-specific EU directive. So it's gonna strengthen the resilience of critical infrastructures against digital threats. I have linked the text of the regulation here on the slide. And as I said, it came already into force in January 2003. But it needs to be implemented by all EU member states by themselves. And there was a deadline, or there is a deadline set by the EU legislator, which said that all EU member states need to be transposed the NIS2 directive into national law until the 17th of October 2024. But now we have June 25, and we don't have national legislation in all EU member states regarding the NIS2 directive. So yeah, a lot of member states have not yet completed the transposition period, especially also Germany. In Germany, we have the specific problem that we had a shift in the in our regulation, because we had the new election in February 25, and because of the principle of discontinuity, the whole process, the whole legislative process had to be started again. But for all you need to know, because we have some uncertainty looking at all the other EU member states, we have in the NIS2 directive a principle of minimum harmonization. So even if you're right now looking at the implementation of NIS2 directive or asking yourself, will I be affected by NIS2 directive, yes or no, you can already start and look at NIS2 directive and also, impose the new obligations under the NIS2 directive, because we have the minimum harmonization standard. This means that all the new provisions stated in the NIS2 directive have to be implemented also in all EU member states. But, and this is the difficulty for companies which operate in different EU member states, because it is a minimum harmonization principle, the member states may go beyond the directive in their implementing laws. So both in terms of scope, but also in terms of requirements. So, for example, the implementing law of the member states in which an establishment is located applies. And that's why you have to look at all the EU national laws which could apply to your company. Having this in mind, I have brought with me a map looking at the current transposition of the NIS2 directive in the EU member states. And you see that they are not all green, a lot of them are yellow, and even 2 of them are red. Red means we don't have any official available information about the transposition period, about the transposition process in those countries, so you don't even know a draft for national law. And the yellow marked countries, there you see we have at least some drafts for the national law, but the national law has not yet come into force. And here again, these national laws vary in some of their regulations. Some have a broader scope of application, some revise only to the NIS2 directive. So there you see there are a lot of differences. But having this in mind and knowing that for starting looking at NIS2 directive, and the minimum and the principle of minimum harmonization, you should look at the minimum rules set out in the NIS2 directive. So if you want to know if your company is maybe affected by the NIS2 directive, you should look at a 3-step or the 3-level assessment set out by the NIS2 directive. So in principle, the NIS2 directive says that companies that carry out activities and provide services that fall into one of the 2 sectors listed in the annexes of the NIS2 directive must implement the requirements if they are considered at least a medium-sized enterprise, according to the EU Commission's definition of small and medium-sized enterprises. I have also linked you the recommendation of the Commission. So you see, you have 3 points that have to be fulfilled, or 3 provisions that have to be fulfilled. First, there's the size cap rule. You have to be a company medium-sized. That means you have to have 50 or more employees, or an annual turnover and an annual balance sheet of more than 10 million. Then you have to look at the sectors, because your company has to fall under one of those sectors, and the sectors are regulated in Annex 1 and 2, which you can see on the right side of the slides. Then the 3rd step is the territorial scope, and this is very important for companies located outside the EU, because the EU legislator has broadened the territorial scope, that it is irrelevant where the company is seated in the world. So if you're also a company located in the US, in Canada, or somewhere else in the world, it doesn't matter, because the only requirement is that you provide your services within the EU. Yeah, and because the determination if you're affected by NIS2 directive or not is in practice very difficult for companies, we have set up a free NIS2 quick check. I have also linked here in the slide, where you can just click through the all different steps with some hints, with some questions, with some more explanation, and there you can check if your company is or falls under the scope of the NIS2 directive or not. When you're looking at the sectors of the NIS2 directive, it is important to note that also secondary activities can open up the application of the NIS2 directive. Because the NIS2 directive has only some sectors where it is stated that companies are excluded if the sectoral activity is not their principal economic activity. So conversely, in other cases, all secondary activities are also subject to the NIS2 directive. And this means that for sectors like energy or digital infrastructures, that a lot of companies will fall under the NIS2 directive, which have not fallen under the NIS directive, which was at stake before. So looking at energy, even a photovoltaic system on the roof of your company can lead to the applicability of NIS2 directive. The same comes when you have a company group and one of your companies in your group is providing digital infrastructures to all the other companies in your group. Then you have, or you're providing data center activities or digital infrastructure activities, and that's why the NIS2 directive can fall or can be applicable to your company. So when you have assessed that your company falls under the scope of the NIS2 directive, the next difficult question is to look at your obligations, because the NIS2 directive follows a holistic approach, which means that we get a lot of new obligations for affected companies. You can divide the new obligations into approximately 5 categories or 5 obligation groups, which I have stated for you here on the slides. The first main obligation is that governance needs to be established by the management bodies, and there will be a personal liability for the management bodies if they are not fulfilling their new obligations. The term management bodies is not clearly defined in the NIS2 directive, but at the very least, it includes the board of directors, managing directors, and also persons at the level of a legal representative. Also, if looking at the governance by the management bodies, it's also important to note that the management bodies need to monitor but also implement the new obligations by the NIS2 directive. So you cannot really delegate the new obligations to some of your staff. Then the second category is awareness at all levels and training, which means that not only the governance bodies need to be trained, focusing on cybersecurity, but as well as the whole staff of your company needs to be focused and sensibilized by or looking at cybersecurity. Then this is one of the main obligations or one of the main part of the regulation in the NIS2 directive. We have a very big list of risk management obligations, risk management measures, or as well as called state-of-the-art measures. So we have there a list of measures that companies need to analyze and assess whether and in which way they need to impose those new obligations. Then number 4 is also very important because we have registration, documentation, and reporting obligations, which means that you have to register your company, whether you fall under the NIS2 directive or not, and you also have to report secure incidents and vulnerability incidents. And the last number is also very important, especially looking at companies being located outside the European Union, because the EU legislator puts a huge focus on supply chain cybersecurity. So that can mean that even if your company is not directly affected by the NIS2 directive, you will be indirectly affected because you are one actor in the supply chain cybersecurity, and that's why maybe you get some new obligations via contractual obligations. Then looking at one of the main obligations, it's the cybersecurity risk management or the cybersecurity risk management measures. And those are minimum measures. You see here a list of different measures which I have stated, or which are stated in the NIS2 directive. And you can see there are different kind of measures that all needs to be implemented by the companies. But there we have a principle of proportionality. So this means the intensity of the measure depends on the category of the organization and also on the risk. So you see, first of all, before you implement the risk management measures, you have to do a risk assessment. And based on this risk assessment, you have to implement the different risk measures. We also get asked if there is some specific guidance on the individual measures. And looking at the NIS2 directive, we only have this kind of checklist or kind of list, but there's no further guidance in the NIS2 directive itself. But you can look at the recitals of the NIS2 directive, which will help in practice, and also the competent authorities in the EU member states as well as the EU Commission will publish in the future some statements and assistance, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. So this is something you should monitor. One further obligation is the obligation to register. Here I have only one example in German law. For you, it's important to note that the obligation to register is not really stated clear in the NIS2 directive, because it's up to the EU member states how they would like to establish the obligation to register. So this is an obligation you really have to monitor in each individual EU member state, because there we have different registration platforms, different registration deadlines. So here is only one example under German law, because we will have one portal, one registration portal of the German authorities as a single portal for registration as well as reporting. And we have a deadline of 3 months after the entity is first considered to be one of the interest entities. And the companies should see the registration as a chance, because the authorities have already stated that they will stay in contact and help the entities to comply with the NIS2 directive. Looking at one of the last obligations, it's the reporting obligations, and here we have a shift, because further earlier we only had one registration process with only one obligation, with only one reporting obligation. But looking right now, we have a reporting obligation which could lead up to in a maximum of 5 reports published to the national authority. And you have to report significant security incidents. And there's the question, well, what is a significant security incident? And this is something you yourself have to identify, because in the NIS2 directive, we only have some criteria for significance. And here we already have some guidance by the EU Commission, also linked here on the slide. It's an implementing regulation of the EU Commission, where you have some examples and some more explanation of when there is a significance and when there's no significant incident. And also for you, important to note that when you fulfill the reporting obligation under NIS2, you still have to fulfill all the other reporting obligations under the other relevant EU laws. So for example, you all know the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. If there is a cybersecurity incident combined with a data breach, then you also have to report the data breach to the competent data authority. So this was one of the first overview looking at NIS2, and here we have some questions.
Yes, so thank you very much for that. Um, I wrote down a few questions here that people ask me on a regular basis, or that, I'm part of several groups of, different kinds of businesses that talk about these rules, and a number of questions keep coming up by the businesses that are going to be affected by these rules. The first one is, where are the rules? I mean, if someone like me, and I work for a small to medium sized business, we operate in multiple jurisdictions. Um, if I, and if I would like, can I go somewhere and just see what are all of the laws that came from this too, so I understand what my company has to do? Does this stuff live in one place?
No, unfortunately not. At least not yet. So there's no official list of all member state laws. We have the NIS2 directive, which you could use as a starting point because of the minimum harmonization principle. But then it is your responsibility, or the responsibility of the companies themselves, to check which national laws are relevant to them, and then also to monitor them. So this is very, very difficult for companies in practice. And that's why we, for example, offer some support here, because we have a NIS2 implementation guide where we inform the companies of new EU member states law and what they what they regulate. And we also have a NIS2 registration and reporting guide, because those are the main obligations that companies need to fulfill right now. And there we have a lot of differences looking at the EU member state laws.
Okay. And another question that comes up in, pretty much every group of businesses that I deal with, they're asking, look, I guess let me ask you the easy question first. If I operate in 12 countries in the EU, let's say operate power plants, I'm generating electricity, and I suffer a cybersecurity incident in one of my power plants in France, am I required to report that incident in Germany, even though it occurred in France? Do I have to report it to every country I operate in?
Yes, that's a very good question, because we have different subjects regulated in the NIS2 directive, because we have companies, we have entities, and also entities located in different EU member states. And usually we don't have a principle of harmonization of incident reporting. So usually when there is a secure incident, you have to report it in each EU member state where you are located, and also where the incident is also relevant. So if you're located in France and in Germany, for example, or you provide your services in France and in Germany, but it only affects your services in France, then you're obliged to report this only to the French authority. But we also get the question if it's not possible to report at one point of contact. So, for example, to report it to a European point of contact, and then all EU member states will know about this. But this is something that is not regulated or not foreseen in the NIS2 directive. So you have to report it in all EU member states to all the national authorities. But in Germany, at least, we see that they are trying to communicate with the other EU authorities to set up a process that you only report to one of the national authorities, and they will hand it further on to the other authorities.
Okay. And so that was sort of the second part of my question, harmonization. But can I ask you, is anyone working on harmonization in sort of even the bigger picture? I mean, if I suffer, let's say I suffer an incident that does affect power production in 3 countries. Well, I've got to report them to 3 authorities in Europe. But if it's a material incident like that, a big incident like that, I'm going to have to report it if the company has stock that's traded in the Security and Exchange Commissions in the United States, I have to report it there. I imagine there's similar rules in stock exchanges in Europe. Every stock exchange that the big company's stock is traded in, they've got to report to that stock exchange the incident if it's a material incident. Um, is there any kind of harmonization going on, not just across countries for NIS2, but across regulators? Because everyone and his
Mhm.
dog wants us to report incidents now.
I understand your question, but it's not as you ask, because this was also something I tried to explain earlier. When you're looking at a GDPR and you have a cybersecurity incident, which also leads to a data breach, you have to report it under the cybersecurity law, so the NIS2 directive, to the NIS2 authority, and you also have to report it under the GDPR to the GDPR compliant authority. So it can happen that if you have one cybersecurity threat or one vulnerability, which you have seen, that you have to report it under a lot of different laws and to a lot of different national authorities. So there is no kind of such harmonization.
Okay, well, I have lots of other questions, but you have more material. We're switching gears now to the CRA rule. Why don't you do that so we can get through that before the end of the hour here?
Yeah, sure. So, yes, just having a quick overview at the Cyber Resilience Act. The Cyber Resilience Act sets new obligations for products with digital elements. And as I said, it is an EU regulation, so there we don't have a problem looking at the transposition into EU national laws. So the EU Cyber Resilience Act will come into force, or has come into force in all EU member states. It is a horizontal and product-related regulation, which means that it's not only focusing on specific products or specific sectors, but it's looking on a broader way and looking at the cybersecurity of all products with digital elements. It came already into force in December 2024, and we have a transitional period of up to 3 years so that the companies can prepare for the new obligations. And having a closer look at the timeline of the CRA, you see that we have like a stepwise application of the Cyber Resilience Act, because in June next year, there are some requirements for the conformity assessment bodies. And then in September of next year, the first obligation for companies will apply. And this is the reporting obligation of security incidents and vulnerabilities. Then in December 2027, the full Cyber Resilience Act will apply. And here, as well as looking at the NIS2 directive, the first question in practice and also for your company is, what is the scope of application? Am I affected by the Cyber Resilience Act, or is my product affected by the Cyber Resilience Act? And here you can also divide into 3 different categories. You have to look at the personal scope of application, the material scope of application, as well as the territorial scope of application. So looking at the personal scope of application, you see that all economic operators within the whole supply chain are regulated by the Cyber Resilience Act. So economic operator means the manufacturer, the authorized representative, the importer, the distributor, or even other natural or legal person who is subject to obligations in relation to the Cyber Resilience Act. But the main obligations are set out to manufacturers, importers, and distributors. Then, looking at the material scope of application, we have the so-called products with digital elements. And there we got a lot of questions because they asked, what are those products with digital elements? And this term is very broad, has to be understood very broad, because it covers all software and hardware products, including also their remote data processing solutions. It also covers software or hardware components. And so all connectable products with digital elements fall under the scope. also standalone software, embedded software, and as well as software components. And this is all new because in the earlier regulation, there were a lot of discussions if software is already regulated or not. And now here we have it explicitly stated that standalone software, embedded software, and as well as also components are regulated by the CRA. We only have a few exceptions and only for products which are already regulated by specific legal requirements, such as, for example, medical devices or in vitro diagnostic devices. Looking at the territorial scope, we have the so-called marketplace principle, and this broadens also the scope of application because it is only necessary that there is a provision of the product in the EU market in the context of a business activity. So it's not necessary that your company is located within the EU. You only need to provide or put your product into the EU market, and then you are already affected by the Cyber Resilience Act. As well as by the NIS2 directive, it's kind of a first hurdle in practice to assess whether you are affected by the Cyber Resilience Act or not. And that's why we also set up a free quick check looking at the application for the Cyber Resilience Act. I also linked here in the slide, and you can also just click through and see if you're probably affected by a CRA or not. Looking also here at the essential obligations for manufacturers, because the Cyber Resilience Act sets out different obligations for the different economic operators, and the main addressee of the Cyber Resilience Act are the manufacturers. And here we have, first of all, the obligation of conformity of the products with the cybersecurity requirements set out in Annex 1, which I will go on later. Then there is the main obligation to undergo assessment of cyber risks. And this obligation is not only during the conception phase of your product, but also during the whole product life cycle. Then there's a new obligation of provision of free security updates, which is very important for companies in practice. As well as we have also reporting obligations in the event of security breaches, and what you maybe already know from the product safety regulation, the obligation for technical documentation. So looking at the conformity obligations or the conformity of the products with the requirements of Annex 1, you can see that you can divide the requirements of Annex 1 into categories again. So one category is cybersecurity requirements, where we have kind of a checklist what your product needs to fulfill. And on the other hand, you see that you have to have a vulnerability management and a process to handle vulnerabilities in your products. And here you can also see one of the new obligations that are stated also in practice are a software bill of materials that you have to conduct an SBOM, as well as also reporting obligations and to have a reporting channel for vulnerabilities. Having a closer look at the reporting obligations, there is the obligation for or to report actively exploited security vulnerabilities. And here again, we have deadlines that are the same as in the NIS2 directive. So we have the early warning, then the report within 72 hours, and the final report within 40 days after the corrective and remedial action. And here it is important to note for companies that here we have kind of a harmonization in the reporting process, because looking at the NIS2 directive, you have to report the incident to each competent national authority. The reporting process under the Cyber Resilience Act is focusing to the ENISA, so it's a European authority. So you have one single point of contact in the EU where you need to report your cybersecurity incidents. So there we have kind of harmonization, and yeah, it's easier for companies to fulfill this obligation. Then just having a quick look at the obligation for importers and distributors, you see that they are already not as strictly regulated as the manufacturers because they are in the supply chain and they have more obligations to check the manufacturer's information and to check the conformity assessment procedure managed by the manufacturer. The importers have also to implement corrective action in the event of non-conformity. And if necessary, they also have the obligation to withdraw or recall the product which is already placed in the market. And we have a lot of notification and information obligations regarding to the national authorities, but also to the users of the product. And the distributors, they have again other obligations, like looking at a graded duty system, and they have obligations adequate for their role and their responsibility in the supply chain. So here again, they need to verify the compliance of the product with the obligations by the manufacturer and importer. So they have to check if those obligations are met. And if there is a case of non-conformity, then they are not obliged to take themselves corrective actions, but they have to initiate corrective measures by the manufacturer or the importer. And we have again information obligations. So you see there's a graded duty system as already know from the new legislative framework. One question, which is also very important for the practice, is what happens if we don't meet the obligations of the Cyber Resilience Act? And here you have to divide between supervisory authorities measures as well as civil law claims. So here in the slide, you see the supervisory authority measures. So they have the power, or they are given the far-reaching powers to monitor and to enforce the regulations. And here we have a hint to the EU market surveillance regulations. So you can, that can be market measures, a verification of products can be stated, instruction of corrective actions, and as well as a recall of products. Then we also have the possibility of setting up very high fines, as you already know, by the NIS2 directive or the GDPR. So there can be fines of up to 15 million euros or 2.5 of the total worldwide annual turnover of the previous financial year. And as I said before, those are the authority sanctions. There is also the possibility of civil law claims in addition, such as claims for damages, because the Cyber Resilience Act is part of product safety law. And this means that the provisions of product liability law can also apply to defective products in the meaning of missing cybersecurity. So again, we have some questions from practice.
Please. Again, these are questions that I was anticipating here because I've been on a lot of these calls with a lot of manufacturers. Let me ask you the first one. I remember reading something about networks. The CRA, does it? I mean, if I have an electric screwdriver, okay, it's this big. It has a little liquid crystal screen on it saying, here's how much power you have left. There's a tiny little CPU in the device with a little bit of software that is animating that power indicator. It is not network connected. Is that device covered by the CRA?
Yes, if you have a digital element, and the term of digital element is very broad. So all those digital elements are covered by the Cyber Resilience Act.
Okay, because that makes so little sense to me. I mean, you buy maybe a bigger example is a refrigerator. Again, a touch screen, control the temperature, how much power am I using, fancy features. When was the last time you, Christina, updated the software in your refrigerator? When was the last time you, as a consumer, looked at the SBOM for the software in your refrigerator? this is not really a question about the rules. It's a question about why the rules make sense. Do you have any insight into why this makes any sense?
Mhm. Well, when you're looking at the recitals of the Cyber Resilience Act, you see that the EU legislators' goal was to make digital products cyber secure and to ensure comprehensive cybersecurity on the whole EU market. And for this reason, the scope of application of the Cyber Resilience Act is very broad. And this is particularly evident from the past experience where connected products did not receive security updates and were therefore vulnerable to attacks. And that's why the EU legislator wanted to address all of those cases and all of those products. So all products with digital elements must therefore be updated in a regularly basis. But it should be noted there's only an obligation for security updates and not functionality updates. As well as the SBOM, you only have the obligation to make a SBOM for yourself. So it's part of the risk assessment by the company, and the SBOM is not provided to the consumers. So it's more of to foster the obligations for the companies to ensure that they are looking at the cybersecurity of their products. But I understand your questions.
Okay, so let me ask you a more specific question. I know that in some geographies, I'm pretty sure it's Germany. Germany does a lot of discrete manufacturing, you know, machining parts, taking parts and assembling them into machines. Um, and uh, a great many of these small businesses, they might have 50 employees, but they are producing, you know, a few dozen machines per year. These are very expensive machines. They're very specialized machines. They're very powerful machines, but the world does not need that many of these machines. So if you produce 20 machines per year, um, any cost that you incur is going to be shared among your customers. Um, and these machines, in my understanding, there's a machine safety rule that says you must certify the machine, the software in the machine to operate safely. You cannot operate an uncertified machine. And if you change anything in the software, if you find a tiny little security vulnerability and the law says you have to issue a patch, you cannot ship that patch until it's been recertified. And certifying it costs, I'm told, between a $250,000 and €500,000. So if we're producing, you know, if we have to issue a dozen patches a year and we have to recertify, let's say once a quarter, because that's how fast we issue the patches, that adds up to millions of dollars a year for a small manufacturer that has to be shared among their customers who really did not want to apply these patches in the first place because this is a safety critical device. They have shielded that device from cyber attack in lots of other ways. Again, it's not a question about sort of the law, but maybe it is. You know, is there provision in the law for these smaller operators, and you know, how much is this going to cost?
Mm-hmm. First of all, when you're looking at the Cyber Resilience Act, there is no obligation to certify your software updates or your patches. So you are only obliged to provide security updates if it is necessary. So if there is a known vulnerability, you are obliged to have a patch or a security update which you have to provide to your consumers. But there is no certification obligation looking to changes of software. The product itself must be certified by the manufacturer. And in addition, there's only the obligation to ensure adequate cybersecurity. And this also includes then the rectification of known vulnerabilities, looking at security updates as well. But there we don't have an obligation to certify those updates or patches. Looking at the question like what this will cost, there's also no estimation or cost estimation in the Cyber Resilience Act. But looking at the regulation as such, there is the rule that each manufacturer of a product, whether if you only have 5 products or 5,000 products, each manufacturer is responsible for implementing the security updates and the patches. And smaller suppliers and manufacturers are not exempt from this. The Commission will provide guidelines to have economic operators, in particular looking at micro, small, and medium-sized companies, to apply the CRA. So maybe there we get some more guidance. And also the EU member states should also support small businesses. This is stated in the CRA. But they are very kind of vague information or information stated in the CRA. So we don't have specific answers to your questions right now when you're looking at the Cyber Resilience Act.
Okay, we are running a little bit late here, so anyone who has to drop off, please do drop off. You will get a link to the recording, and you know, hopefully be able to log in and you know, see the rest of the presentation here. I know that, Christina, I have lots more questions, but I know that you have more material on supply chain. So why don't you continue for a while, and then we'll get to the questions that attendees have asked, and you know, probably wrap up 10 or 15 minutes late.
Yeah, sure. I will also just go quickly through the last slide. So looking at the supply chain cybersecurity, because this is something which I already said, looking at NIS2 and Cyber Resilience Act. You see, when you're looking at the new obligations under NIS2 Directive as well as under the Cyber Resilience Act, that the EU legislator has put a specific focus on the supply chain cybersecurity. Because in the recent past, we have seen increasing attacks on the cybersecurity of supply chain. And that's why the EU legislator said, okay, we need to focus on the supply chain cybersecurity. We need to implement new obligations on the supply chain. And when you're looking on NIS2 as well as on the Cyber Resilience Act, you see that there are different kind of obligations. In the NIS2 directive, we have the obligation of entities to monitor the cybersecurity of their suppliers and to ensure the cybersecurity in their or of their suppliers. And then when you're looking at the Cyber Resilience Act, there you have the explicit obligation to provide a software bill of materials, which means that you have to have a formal record containing details of your supply chain and also of your supply chain relationships of the specific components which are included in your product. And also the manufacturers are obliged to report security breaches not only to the national authorities, but also within the supply chain. And not the other way around, because they have to ensure supply chain cybersecurity, they have to oblige their suppliers to give some information if there's a vulnerability or a secure incident. So when you're looking at the impact on the supply chain by NIS2 and Cyber Resilience Act, you see that you have your own obligations looking at your company. You have the legal obligations under EU as well as national cybersecurity law. And that's why you have to ensure processes and organizations within your company to ensure cybersecurity as such. But on the other hand, you also have to focus more on your external relationships. So you have to focus on your suppliers and your service providers if they are cyber-secure, if their products are cyber-secure, whether their processes. And there is the means of choice was and also will be contractual agreements. And this means that maybe you are not a company here located in the middle of the picture. So maybe you're not directly affected by the NIS2 Directive or the Cyber Resilience Act, but it can and it will happen in the future that also suppliers and service providers all over in the world are maybe not directly affected, but they will be indirectly affected because of new contractual agreements within the supply chain. So that's why it's very important to look at the existing, but also at the new contractual frameworks, because there you see that there will be a lot of new obligations for suppliers and service providers. And mostly those are the obligations set out in the NIS2 Directive and the Cyber Resilience Act, which will then be transposed into the supply chain. So you will see that there are new obligations looking at the assessment of cyber risks and cyber risk management. There will be new obligations of data backup and recovery, looking at the use of subcontractors. You already know maybe from the GDPR and data protection cases, but here we also need to focus on subcontractors looking at the cybersecurity cases. Then a very important obligation is the provision of security updates, free security updates. And also very important to note is new provisions and new rules of incident response as well as incident response readiness. But if you're a company which is directly affected by NIS2 and CRA, it is very important that you not only put those new obligations into your contract, it's very important that you also implement a contractual authority to control and also to enforce the duties, because unless the obligations are useless in practice. So the obligations must be defined, and you also have to have regulations for monitoring and enforcing the new contractual obligations that are required. So looking at the new obligations, either if it's NIS2 or CRA or both of them, you should do at least, or you should undergo at least those 4 steps, looking if your company is affected or not, and then what obligations apply. So first of all, you should check your effectiveness. You should check, am I affected by NIS2 and or Cyber Resilience Act or any other regulation? And there you should not only check the EU legislation, but you should also check the national legislation, especially when you're looking at NIS2. Then you should clarify your role, because the economic operators in the supply chain are all regulated now under EU law. So you are not out of scope when you are not a manufacturer. So you have to check, even if I'm only an importer or distributor, I can be affected by CRA and NIS2. Then you have to check the relevant requirements. You have to do a checklist, and then you have to implement those new requirements. And those focus on technical measures, so that you have to undergo a gap analysis, but also especially legal measures, especially when you're looking at the supply chain. There you should at least check your contract design and your contract process management. And then overall, like in all compliance cycle or compliance process, you need to monitor, because in the NIS2 directive, as well as in the Cyber Resilience Act, we see that the EU Commission, that the national authorities have all the power to implement new guidance, new statements, which can help you in practice to implement and to impose the new cybersecurity regulations. So there will be some more guidance in the future, which can be very helpful for companies in practice. And that's why you should monitor not only your internal processes and your business model, but also the legal situation and the statements of the authorities. So this was a quick run through the supply chain cybersecurity as well as the compliance process. So we can now,
let's
go
wrap
on
up.
to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. For anyone who hasn't heard about Waterfall, thank you for joining the webinar. Waterfall produces a family of products that are hardware enforced OT security. Dramatically more secure than software only, because all software has vulnerabilities. We have technology that fits at the IT-OT interface and dramatically reduces the ability of attackers to get into OT, dramatically reduces the possibility of dependencies, dramatically reduces the need for abundance of caution shutdowns. So we're all about the IT-OT interface. Hardware enforced remote access is our latest innovation. Again, dramatically stronger than software. So this is what Waterfall is about. Christina, a lot of our audience has not heard of Reuschler. Could you say a few words about what you folks do there?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Reuschler, and we are a law firm, a German law firm with offices in Berlin and another city in Germany called Saarbrücken in the southwest of Germany. We are a team of 35 to 40 experts at 2 locations in Germany, and we advise companies from dynamic industrial sectors worldwide. So we are not only focusing on Germany. And the firm was founded over 20 years ago by our founder, Philipp Reusch. The firm originally was specialized in traditional product safety and product liability law. But as a result of the firm's growth and increasing digitalization and networking of products and services, A third department, the digital business department, was established alongside as our mobility department. Me, myself, I'm working in our digital business department, so I am advising companies and public authorities on complex issues of data protection, IT law, and cybersecurity, and both nationally and internationally. This slide here is only for your information, where you can see more details of what we are working in our digital business unit. So it ranges from data protection, cybersecurity, product liability, and so on and so on. And yeah, just another slide that you know, we are based in Germany, but we are advising companies all over the world and helping you to go into the EU market, as well as advising to outbound activities.
And if you could go one more slide, thank you. So this is sort of the summary here. We're going to get to some questions and answers for a few minutes. You know, the CRA is a set of rules and regulations. NIS2 is different in every country. If you know, there's resources here. If you just reminders of where to get these resources and you know, dig deeper into it. The waterfall threat report on the right is available for download. And you know, my latest book, we haven't said much about it, but if you're interested, I've written 3 books on the topic. This is my latest. Waterfall gives these things away. If you're interested, go to that URL and you can request a free copy. Did you want to add some summary before we get into the Q&A?
Yeah, just a short summary, because I think I've said already, because you have seen, even though uncertainties remain looking at the cybersecurity law in Europe and not all laws have been finalized, the important takeaway for you is that companies should act now and should review and implement the relevant cybersecurity laws and obligations. And especially international companies should check in particular where they are affected by the new regulations themselves, or at least indirectly through new contractual requirements in the supply chain. And that's why I also linked again our NIS2 check and our CRA check, which will help companies to overcome the first hurdle of assessing whether they are affected or not by the new obligations.
Okay, so thank you for that. We have a lot of questions. We're going to take a few of these, and then again, we're going to cut it off, but we will try and follow up with the questions we do not get to. We'll try to follow up with them by email as well. So let me ask you, hopefully a quick and easy one first, and then a harder one. The hopefully quick and easy one, the CRA, does it apply to custom-built stuff? So for example, if a billionaire wants a super yacht, it's going to be unlike anyone else's super yacht. It's going to be unique in the world. Or, you know, forget a billionaire. If a metro wants, you know, 100 locomotives for trains in the city, my understanding is that every one of these orders is different. No 2 metros use the same locomotives. They are built to the specifications of the customer. Or even, you know, let's say a power provider gives a contract to a big, you know, a big company like, I don't know, Siemens or ABB, and says, please build me a power plant. This is the plant I want. Here is where I want it. We have all of the permissions to build this plant. Build my plant. And there's one of them in the world, and it's going to be different from every other plant that this company has built. Does the CRA apply to that kind of manufacturer, if you like?
Yes, if this product is a product with digital elements, then the CRA will apply. And you can say definitely yes, because we don't have an exemption for specific product for specific manufactured product or custom-wise product, because we have one specific rule when you're looking at the obligation to provide free security updates. There we have one exemption, that you may charge for security updates if you have a customized product. So in reverse, you see the CRA applies to customized products, but we have kind of different regulations, or one exemption at least for such products.
Okay, thank you. So here's a harder question. Was about NIS2, talking about small and medium enterprises. The smallest enterprises that NIS2 applied, that the NIS2 laws are going to apply to, are the ones that are going to, struggle the most to follow the new rules. Do you have any advice for, what the smallest entities that are going to be covered by NIS2, what they should do?
Mm. Um, they should firstly assess if they are affected by the NIS2 directive. They should document their assessment, and then they should also document their assessment of what obligations apply to them and how they can fulfill the obligations. Because when you're looking at a risk management measures, which are the main obligation in the NIS2 directive, we have a principle of proportionality. So that means that small companies or medium-sized companies are not obliged to fulfill those risk management measures in such a broad way as big companies. But there it is important to document your assessment process, looking at those necessary risk management measures and how or no, why and how you are implementing your measures in this or that way. So if you document it and you can and you have reasons why you are implementing your measures in this or that way, then you are already safe when the national authority is coming to your company.
Okay. Um, so I'm scrolling through the questions here. Another one that strikes me as very relevant is, look, um, we have European suppliers, CRA, European suppliers supplying the European market. They must comply with the CRA, and that's going to incur some costs. If they're producing an off-the-shelf product, they're going to have to give out free security updates. For low volume off-the-shelf products, this might not have been the case in the past. This is going to impact their revenues. Um, these companies may also be selling product into China, into United States, that have no such rules. Um, presumably they can charge for their patches in those other geographies, but the question is, the businesses that you work with, are they concerned? Are they asking you, is this going to put them at a competitive disadvantage? Because an American firm selling into America has no such rule, whereas a European firm selling into America has to follow these rules. Is this going to be a disadvantage for global sales? Any insights on that?
We see at least that this question is very discussed by our clients. And there we have different approaches where they can meet those new obligations or how they can face those new challenges. And one approach is that they say, well, we have the CRA and NIS2 as a very strict obligation, as a very strict regulatory framework with impact not only on the EU, but also on companies worldwide. So they assume that also companies outside of the EU will at some time face the new obligations at NIS2 and CRA. And that's why they say, okay, let's fulfill the strict obligations under NIS2 and CRA for all of the markets we are providing our products on. Because they say at some point or at some time, there will be kind of a market adventure for EU compliant products. But then we also have some other clients which divide their product manufacturing processes, and they manufacture products for the EU market, which fulfill all the strict new obligations. And then also another manufacturing process for products provided in the US, in all the other parts of the world. So they are dividing their products into EU products and non-EU products.
Okay. Maybe another couple questions, and we'll cut it off here. One, I know you and I had discussed this preparing for this call, but the question has come up from one of the attendees about contractual obligations and the supply chain. Um, the way I phrased the question was a concrete example. If I embed, I don't know, a Microsoft SQL Server database in one of my products, okay, I can buy the right to embed the product in my component because I build a big system and I need a database. So I use Microsoft. Just pick on Microsoft just by example. Um, I go to Microsoft and say, here's my contract requirements. If I'm going to buy 100 of your databases, it's going to cost me, I don't know what one of these databases costs. I'm guessing a license is, I don't know, $3,000. So we're talking, $300,000. I'm going to give you $300,000, but you have to sign that you're going to give me free software updates and you're going to do this and you're going to give me um, Microsoft, I'm guessing, is going to say, take a flying leap. Here's our contract rules, sign it or leave. How can a smaller customer work with these larger suppliers? Is this even realistic?
Hmm. Well, we see this kind of cases also in the mobility sector because we are advising a lot of suppliers and distributors in the mobility sector, and then they have to face conducting a contract with the OEMs in the automotive sector. So there we have the same problems. But you can say now, you see in practice that the small suppliers and distributors have mostly not the power to go to an OEM such as Microsoft or a big company such as Microsoft to say, well, here's my contract, you have to sign it because I am obliged by CRA and NIS2. But you see that there's also a shift within the big companies because they are as well obliged under NIS2 and CRA. That's why they are also amending their contracts. So for the small suppliers and distributors, it's important not maybe to hand out their own contracts to the big firms, but rather to assess the contracts which are provided by the big firms, and then to assess if they all fulfill the new obligations under CRA and or NIS2. And then if you see maybe there's one obligation which is not fully conform with the CRA or the NIS2, then you can go into negotiations. But when you're looking at the new contracts of, for example, Microsoft, you see that they know that they are also affected by NIS2 and CRA, and you see also there is a shift into their contracts. So for you, for small and medium-sized enterprises, it's rather to assess the contracts by the big firms and to look at that those contracts fulfill the new obligation.
Okay, so thank you for that. Let me throw just one more question in here, and then we'll let you go. Thank you so much. This is a question having to do with systems integrators. If, for example, I go to a power plant as a service provider, I'm selling my time, a team of people, and the power plant says, I would like a new, I don't know, emissions optimization system deployed. So if the power plant goes to um, the vendor and says, I want one of these and buys it. And the vendor says, but you also need a database. So they go to a database provider and buy the database. They buy the software, and then I come in as a service provider and configure the software. Do I incur CRA obligations as a manufacturer? And the other side of the coin is if the contract is written the other way, saying, no, Andrew, one of the things that you do well is negotiate with these suppliers. So instead of me, the power plant, buying these components and you configuring them, I want you to go out and buy those components and sell them back to me because you negotiate better deals than I do. Does that change the equation? As a systems integrator, what kind of obligations am I incurring here? And what do I have to watch for that I don't do that, is going to bite me?
Those are very interesting questions, and those are questions I really have to look in detail into each individual case. But this is exactly the point, what I also said looking at the compliance process. You have to check the specific case if the NIS2 or the CRA are applicable, and also in which role you're working or providing your services on. Because when you're only providing your services and not a product, you're not falling under the Cyber Resilience Act. Especially when you're looking at software. If you manufacture software and you sell your software, then you're a manufacturer under the Cyber Resilience Act. But if you're providing your software as a service, it's stated in the recital of the Cyber Resilience Act that such cloud services, software as a service, falls under the NIS2 directive. So then you have to check. I am maybe not a manufacturer of a product, but I may be a provider of a service. But then you have to check if the service falls under another regulatory framework. So this would be the NIS2 directive. So if you're providing data center activities, digital infrastructure services, then you can fall under NIS2 directive. So you have kind of the same obligation. And in your question, the second case was that one, or that your client says, well, you should negotiate with the manufacturer and you should resell the product to me. Then you're maybe not a manufacturer if you really just resell the product, but then you're importer or a distributor, and then you fall at least under the CRA as a distributor. And if you do some material changes and adjustments to the software you bought for the client, then it can happen that you will be a so-called quasi-manufacturer. So it's very interesting and very difficult.
I was going to say, yeah, when you say interesting, I hear complicated. So I guess that's why I'm a lawyer. But thank you so much for joining us. There's other questions we did not get to. I will send you these questions. Let's try and get some answers out to these folks who the good people who asked questions. Thank you so much for the information. Everybody will get a link to the recording, and I guess we all look forward to complying with NIS2 and CRA in the future.